Hello guys. Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be discussing an opening that you can play against with 1 e4 and e5. Now, first off, the first move of this opening is going to be f4, which is now the King's Gambit. The King's Gambit is a pretty old opening with a lot of rich history and detail, but I'm going to be trying to explain the main ideas in the most simplest way I can. So in the King's Gambit, there's two ways to play. In the King's Gambit, you can either play there's d5, which is the Falkbeer counter gambit as black, but most people usually either play d6, which is the King's Gambit declined. Now, for this video, we're going to be discussing the accepted version. So King's Gambit accepted. Now, you do not want to make the mistake of playing d4. It is not a Queen's Gambit. It can be played if you're like a pro and you know what you're doing, but d4 on the second move, d4 on the second move is never the move. Because if you ever see your opponent play d4 as black, you're going to go queen h4 check, and they're going to be forced to move their king. Now, in the King's Gambit, it's usually noted that in the King's Gambit, the king is usually going to be checked and is going to have to move. But if you do end up playing this gambit, just be careful that, let's just say, this happens. Just don't be dumb enough to fall into this. Because now, well, like, if you don't want to get your queen, your king and queen skewered, so just make sure not to fall into any sort of trap. You know, you can't do that right now, but just saying, just be wary. But that's not how you play it. Your second move, there's two moves that I recommend. There's knight f3, which is the king's knight gambit, and the king's bishop gambit, which is bishop c4. Now, we're going to be talking in this video about the knight variation, king's knight gambit. Now, there is few good moves for black. As black, I recommend g5, and then you can usually play h4. If they go g5, you're gonna play h4, and your idea is gonna try to grab this pawn here. And in later, you will actually castle king side. You do not want to castle queen side usually. Usually, you want to castle king side. Queen side, it's a little bit inaccurate, but it leads to a bit more positional play. So that's g5. Now, if your opponent goes knight f6, which is the Shallop's defense, it's not necessarily the best moves. As you can see, it gives back a little bit of the advantage back to you. You're going to want to play e5. And now you're gaining time, and the knight's going to have to move. The knight usually goes to h5. But if it goes to h5, you can just start developing normally. d4, and the basic rules of developing. Just to get your bishops out and get your knights out. So that's the Shallop's defense. Now, usually you're gonna go against like stuff like say bishop e7 or something like that, Cunningham defense. And in this case, you usually just wanna chillax, just develop normally, then play d4. Make sure in the King's Gambit you always play knight f3 before taking the center, because like I discussed earlier, you're gonna get into a lot of queen h4 mumbo jumbo. And yeah, that's the basic ideas of the Knight's Gambit. Also, knight c6, same thing. You're just gonna want to start developing normally. Just play d4. You're fine. So this is why the King's Gambit is actually very easy to learn, very easy to understand. Now later in the game, so let's just imagine a game. Let's just imagine a position that is something like this. Okay, let's just imagine a position that's something like this. So you're always gonna want to castle kingside. Obviously, there's a lot of track text here. This bishop's hanging, blah blah blah. We're not talking about that right now. We're just talking about how. So your castle kingside. You always like I said earlier. You're always gonna want to castle kingside because your rook on the f file. This f file is gonna be open. So later in the game, let's say something like this happens. Your f file is going to be open, and your idea is that you're gonna if your opponent's king castles king side, you're also just going to want to apply pressure, aim pieces toward the opponent's king, and try to bombard them on the F file, something like this. This is the idea that you're going for. Obviously, not this position. There's a lot of tactic here. Bishop takes h2, stuff like that. That's just the idea. You don't want to castle queenside necessarily. So I'll go back. You usually do not want to castle queenside, and I'll show you in a moment. Castling queenside is just not accurate because the whole point of the king's gambit is to get this f file open. And if you don't do that, then there's no point because you might as well just be playing the queen's gambit then if you're going to be castling kingside. The kingside is supposed to be sort of old and aggressive way of playing. So yeah, you're always going to want to castle kingside. Anyways, that would be it for this video. I'm going to make a part 2 to this video and try to hopefully go into more detail about other variations like the bishop's gambit that I mentioned earlier. And